Hi, how are you doing today? Um, so earlier this summer, I went with my family to see the most recent Jurassic World movie, and we really had a lot of fun watching it. And no, it's not as good as the original, and uh, none of the sequels have really been able to touch that original movie. It was such a true masterpiece of cinema. But I've kept going back to see the sequels like millions of other people, and largely because of the excitement and wonder of seeing these dinosaurs presented in such a realistic way. And something upon watching the movie recently, I thought about is that these movies illustrate dramatically something really real about these mysterious giants from the past. On one hand, we do have this deep longing to see these creatures, but these movies also show us what the problems are with that come inherent with humans sharing the earth with such large and dangerous creatures. Now, science tells us that dinosaurs went extinct millions of years before the emergence of man, but many Christians insist that dinosaurs and mankind lived side by side, up until a few thousand years ago. And here on this channel, I've been exploring the intersection of the Christian faith with science. And the last three videos in this series have been really addressing the philosophical presupposition of naturalism that many scientifically minded people tend to have. And I've been criticizing that view, but I really started this series by explaining that many, if not most, evangelicals approach the Bible with this false presupposition that anything the Bible says must be scientifically accurate. According to this view, when scientific discovery contradicts the Bible, the science must be wrong. In the video, I focused on how the inaccurate assumption about the Bible, being scientifically accurate, really caused the Roman Catholic Church to condemn Galileo's scientific discovery that the Earth rotates around the sun rather than the other way around. Now, the vast majority of Christians have come to accept Galileo as being correct on this. Still, many evangelicals are in conflict with science when it comes to the age of the Earth and how the Earth came about. The scientific consensus is that the universe began with a Big Bang billions of years ago, and that life evolved on Earth over a process of millions of years. The dominant position with evangelicalism is that God created the world in 6 days, and those 6 days occurred only a few thousand years ago. Now, does this conflict leave Christianity and science at an impasse? Must Christians reject scientific knowledge and cling to their interpretation of the Bible regardless of the evidence against it? Conversely, does this mean that a scientifically minded person must reject the Christian faith as a collection of ancient myths with no basis in reality? I say the answer to both of those questions is no. Just as modern Christians admit that the sun is the center of the solar system, and those who condemned Galileo misinterpreted the scripture, it's time to accept that modern evangelicals who can accept can accept these scientific discoveries are also misinterpreting the scriptures. Once we understand that God accommodated his revelation of himself to the authors of the Bible so that the incomprehensible spiritual truths that could somewhat partially be understood by us finite human beings, so we can accept that speaking through the human authors, God described the world in accordance with their understanding of how it worked, not his understanding, and certainly not our modern understanding. This means that the Bible informs us about spiritual realities such as theology and ethics, but it doesn't reveal scientific concepts. When we accept this inescapable reality about the Bible's nature, it becomes possible to affirm the Bible as the Word of God while it also accepting the discoveries of modern science. So let's take a closer look at the claims made by these evangelicals. They hold a position that takes a very simplistic interpretation of the first chapters of Genesis, reading it in a straightforward historical as a straightforward historical account of what actually occurred at the creation of the world. They treat it as if it was, a newspaper report of what happened. And they refer to their interpretation as a literal reading of Genesis, though I'd argue that they don't read it as literally as they think they do. Nevertheless, based on their reading, these Christians conclude that God created the world in 6 days. And in the 17th century, Bishop Ussher examined the genealogies in Genesis to calculate the date of creation. According to Ussher, the in the beginning of Genesis 1:1 occurred on October 23rd, 4004 BC at 9 a.m. I'm not sure how he could be so precise as to have known, have it nailed down to the exact hour, and I'm not sure what time zone that hour applied to. But I did grow up in a fundamentalist church that taught this view of Scripture. And when I was in my teens, devoted to coming to a deeper understanding of the Bible, and long before I realized that Bishop Ussher had already done the work for me, I took it upon myself to do my own calculations using the same approach. And I was smart enough to realize I couldn't get it down to the exact year, much less the day and the hour, but I determined that the universe was around 6,000 years old. And this evangelical position has come to be known as the young earth creationist position, or young earth creationism. Young earth creation, it's called a young earth because it claims that, again, the earth is 6,000 years old versus the 4.5 billion years old that is the current estimate of science. Now, to counter the claims of what they dub secular science, these young earth apologists have developed an entire field of study they call creation science. And they do so to make the case for young earth. Pick a little side here to say that they call this science, and science dismiss it as bad science, and they say it's actually theology rather than science. When I was a graduate assistant in a theology program, students who wanted to do creation science in their theology papers got it kicked out because it was bad theology. It was considered, that's science, not theology. So it's some kind of weird thing that's not quite science, it's not quite theology, and it blends the two into its own thing. But that's a little side. But these creation scientists set out to reinterpret the scientific data to fit their interpretation of Genesis. They accept microevolution, that a species adapts within its species to better fit its environment. And we can't deny that because it's been corroborated by direct observation. They reject, however, macroevolution, that one species can actually evolve into a completely different species. Now, some of the most prominent creationists, or creation scientists as they call themselves, are Henry Morris, Kent Hovind, and possibly the most well-known is Ken Ham, who started the Answers in Genesis group and built a life-size reproduction of Noah's Ark out in Kentucky. And another somewhat more respectable proponent was Kurt Wise. Wise actually has a PhD in paleontology from Harvard University, making him perhaps the only creation scientist with the expertise to do his work. When you really look at the educational background of these other guys, they're really, it's like, are they qualified to even make the claims that they're making? For example, Henry Morris, he does have a PhD in hydraulic engineering from the University of Minnesota, so he has a doctorate in a science-related field from an accredited university, but his education isn't in paleontology or geology or astronomy or any of the other fields related to studying this issue. And then you have Ken Ham. He has a bachelor's of applied science, so he didn't go beyond a bachelor's degree. And then Kent Hovind has multiple degrees, including a doctorate degree. but they're all from unaccredited fundamentalist universities. And so his doctorate degree was actually completed through the mail in correspondence courses. So, so other than wise, these creation scientists, can hardly be described as scientists at all. So, let's talk about the problem with creation science. As I stated earlier, I was indoctrinated into this kind of thinking as a child, and my early formal education reinforced this perspective. The church I grew up in actually had an associate pastor whose father was involved in starting a creation evidence museum around the supposed human footprints that they discovered alongside the dinosaur footprints here in North Texas, where I live. He and this, my associate pastor's father, he brought the cast of these footprints to show the church, along with a presentation filled with wild claims that, as a young man, I bought those claims hook, line, and sinker. I was just a teenager at the time. And then my first theology professor in college was very conservative, and he insisted that the literal reading of Genesis was the only reading that didn't compromise the integrity of scriptures. One of Henry Morse's creationist books was actually required reading. It was titled The Long War Against God. I still have my copy. And this book emphasized that the claims of science recognized, or the claims of science regarding evolution, they were a direct attack on the Christian faith and God Himself. It was, just this scientific inquiry. It wasn't just scientific discovery. It was an assault on the beliefs that are so near and dear to us. So I believed that young Earth creationism was the front line in defending the Christian faith. And I admit I advocated and defended this position for years. I led several Bible studies in churches in which I insisted that this was the right position. And I initially did so with full confidence that I was right, but eventually deep down I started having some troubles with the immense evidence against the position I thought I had to hold on to. And I remember teaching in a church on this topic when there's a guy in the class, and he brought in his experience as an oil worker. He testified from his experience that the fossils that the oil rig dug up were different as he drilled deeper down into the earth. Now, this was a real challenge for me because this wasn't some fancy scientist who was trying to attack my faith like I experienced in my freshman year of community college. I had a biology professor who did want to undermine our faith and Christian and beliefs, and he was an opponent of Christianity. But this is a blue collar guy, and just to give you an idea of what he was like, he referred to the animals that the fossils dug up as critters. He was also an upstanding Christian man, but his own personal experience could corroborate the scientific evidence that I'd been told was not so credible. And I admitted I didn't know how to respond. But I was confident that there was a logical answer out there. And I thought that logical answer would conform to my young earth belief system. And it really took me years of study and reflection for me to be able to answer the challenge that this old retired oil worker presented me in that Bible study. And ultimately, it was a rather simple answer. Young earth creationism just isn't true. I don't say this lightly, and I'm certainly not trying to undermine anyone's faith in Jesus or the Bible. Nevertheless, the evidence against a young earth creation is really insurmountable. I believe in the power of God, and I am confident that God is certainly capable of creating the world in 6 days. He could have done it in 1 day. But the evidence is clear that He chose to work over billions of years to prepare this earth that we have come to call home. So what do we make then of this counter evidence presented by young earth creationists? When I was scientifically illiterate, and I had my the only formal scientific training I had is I took freshman biology in college, as I referred to in a community college. By that time, I was so entrenched in my evangelicalism that I was very hostile to it. So I learned it well, but I was, anything related to evolution, I was ready to knock down and try to criticize. So I didn't really ever understand it as well as I should have. And in that place, being scientifically really illiterate and having a very shallow understanding of these concepts, and really desperate for any evidence that corroborated what I believed, the arguments of these young Earth creationists sounded really convincing to me. But this is because of what is called confirmation bias. There's a human tendency to uncritically accept information that conforms to our opinions and beliefs, while at the same time we tend to be hypercritical or even just reject out of hand any information that contradicts our own beliefs and opinions. And if we really want to find truth, we have to move beyond confirmation bias. We have to be willing to truly, honestly, be willing to evaluate and consider positions that are different than what we've been inclined to believe in the past. And I'm not an expert in science. I'm going to state that very clearly. But when I started applying some critical thinking to the evidence that these young Earth creationists had presented to me, it wasn't so convincing. And I then took it upon myself to do some very basic research and learn some very basic science. And with a very, surface level understanding of the science, I started to be able to recognize even where I was of how the evidence presented by these creation scientists was really ridiculously weak. Much of the work of these creation scientists involves drawing attention to anomalies in the scientific data and concluding that these anomalies upends the entire science and everything that we believe about Earth. And so that's really some bad research mentality, because just because you find a little bit of data that doesn't fit with what with what all the other evidence seems to suggest, you don't just sit there and use that to throw out all the evidence. You sit there and reevaluate and correct and tweak and look at, did we recheck your measurements? You do a lot of other things. You don't say, oh, I found one piece of evidence that doesn't fit along with as neatly along with everything that I thought it would, and just say, okay, that's it. Everything is wrong. But something that troubles me is that to find these anomalies that these creation apologists will point to, they had to dig through all the data pointing to the Earth being millions of years old and the universe being billions of years old, and they had to reject all this evidence while searching for something that they could use to twist and make the argument that the Earth is only a few thousand years old. And to be able to dig through all that evidence to find the little pieces of evidence that would back up what they wanted to say, that would require a level of confirmation bias that I really can't imagine. And honestly, in some cases, I'm suspicious that some of these so-called creation scientists aren't operating in good faith. While they accuse the scientific community of manipulating the data and some kind of grand conspiracy to contradict the Bible, I fear that they might be the ones who are intentionally manipulating data to support a religious agenda. And if they aren't being deliberately manipulative, they certainly don't understand the science that they have devoted their life to debunking. The creationist arguments that they use are frequently rebutting a mischaracterization of the scientific consensus rather than what scientists actually hold to be true. Now, I'm an English teacher, so I teach my students about techniques of, fallacious argumentative techniques. And one of the techniques that we point to is what this is called. It's a straw man argument. And a straw man argument is when you attack a caricature of your opponent's position rather than their actual position, because that caricature is easier to knock down, just as it would be easier if you were in an actual fist fight and you fought dressed up a scarecrow, dressed like your opponent, and punched that scarecrow and knocked it over. That would be a whole lot easier than actually fighting an actual opponent who's fighting back. And so therefore it's called a straw man argument. You're not actually attacking the position, you're attacking a characterization of the position that you can easily tear down. And Kent Hovind, the creation evidence person, he relies heavily on straw man arguments, and he throws in a heavy dose of mockery, to laugh at it, to convince an audience who's really eager to believe him that the well-researched findings of science are ridiculous, when he's really just pulling the wool over their eyes, whether intentionally or not. If he's arguing in good faith, he really doesn't understand the positions of science. And now Kent Hovind and other creationists sometimes do well in debates with actual scientists, but they also, use, and the straw man arguments are part of it, but they use another dishonest rhetorical technique that I typically call the fire hood of falsehood, which is just throwing so much bad information out there that it's hard to deal with. See, it takes only seconds to tell a lie, but several minutes to explain how and why it isn't true. So in a debate, a person has a set amount of time to answer a question, and the other person has a set amount of time to respond to that answer. Now, if there are several false statements in a response, the other person will not have time to refute all those false statements in their rebuttal. As a result, a person who's willing to speak with complete disregard for the facts will often win a debate. And that's why sometimes a formal debate setting isn't always the best means of discovering the truth. You need to actually read the full-on arguments from both sides and do your own research. And politicians often use this technique, making so many false claims that a person can't possibly refute them all. They can't fact check everything. And eventually some of the things they say start to be accepted as true. Now, if you don't believe any of the young earth creationists, these are good, godly men, they wouldn't do something so low. You don't think that they would do that? Well, another name for this technique, which I typically call the fire hood of falsehood, but the other name for this same technique is the Gish Gallop. It got its name from creation apologist Duane Gish, the former vice president of the Institute for Creation Research. So imagine using a dishonest argumentative technique so much that it was actually named after you. So, yeah, there are some dishonest and deceptive points being made by these creation apologists. It doesn't give me joy to say that, but it's just the facts. So let's look at what the science actually tells us about the age of the earth. Now, in this discussion, I'm not going to discuss evolution. I personally believe and come to accept that evolution occurs and has occurred in the past at both the micro and macro level. In other words, I don't only believe that species adapt within themselves, but at some level, we have had species that actually have evolved into other species. I am still a little bit skeptical that this occurs at the scale that most scientists believe. I'm not confident that all the various species evolved from a single ancestor. I I suspect that some species were directly created over the millions of years which God spent preparing the earth, but I'm really not confident one way or the other in this, so I'm not going to argue, make a point of this. So in this discussion, I'm just going to focus strictly on whether or not the evidence supports creation as an event that occurred a few thousand years ago, or was it a process that took place over millions and billions of years. You know, I can't in a single video deal with all the evidence, but I'm going to point to some of the points that I found particularly compelling that forced me to open my eyes to what the Bible actually says. So let's start with looking at what archaeology and history tells us. Archaeological and historical studies have told us that human civilization goes back too far to fit the traditional understanding of the young earth creationists. If we use the genealogies in Genesis to date creation the way that the young earth creationists do, then Noah's flood would have happened less than 3,000 years ago. Bishop Ussher, giving his very exact confident dates, put it at 2348 BC. So 2348 BC. The problem is that the Mesopotamian Empire, which many people know better today by its capital city of Babylon, was founded around 3100 BC and lasted until 539 BC. That means that an empire, the Bible readily acknowledges in multiple places, that means that empire existed nearly 1,000 years before the flood, and that empire not only wasn't destroyed by the flood, but it continued on until the end of the Old Testament era, or near the end of the Old Testament era. Now, my young Earth creationist professors that I studied under, they acknowledged that this was a problem. They argued that there are actually gaps in the genealogies in Genesis. This means we can't use Ussher's method for getting an exact dating for creation. And with these gaps, they say that creation probably happened around 10,000 years ago rather than 6,000 years ago. Now, this does address the problems with the that we have with the historical and archaeological data. But even as a young man, I accepted it as a more scholarly approach to young Earth creation. But it really occurred to me deep down that in making this concession, we weren't really interpreting the Bible literally anymore, which was the whole point of the argument. So this means that even many young Earth proponents have to acknowledge that creation couldn't have happened when the literal interpretation of Genesis says that it happened. Now let's move from archaeology and history to astronomy. When we look up at the stars in the sky, it is proof that the universe is much older than young Earth creationists claim. At the time of the Bible, they believed that the stars were all lights in a dome over the earth, and therefore were all the same distance from us. But today we know that the stars are giant balls of burning gas spread across the vast reaches of space. The object furthest from us that is still visible with the naked eye is the Andromeda Galaxy. It is 2.5 million light years away from us. This means that when we look up into the night sky and we see it, what we are actually seeing is the light it produced 2.5 million years ago, and it's just now reaching us. When we look at it, we are literally looking 2.5 million years into the past. And if God were to wipe the Andromeda Galaxy out of existence right now at this very moment, we would continue to see it for another 2.5 million years. The problem is, if the universe is only 10,000 years old, which is the more adjusted acceptance of outer reaches of young Earth creationists. I think I've heard some go as far as 15,000 years old. But if that was the case, if it was only 10,000 years old, we wouldn't be able to see it at all yet. We would not. The Andromeda Galaxy would not have reached us. The first beams of light created by the Andromeda Galaxy still wouldn't reach us for another 2,490 years. I'm sorry, 2,490,000 years. I'm sorry, you got put the comma in the wrong place when I read that. So the fact is that if we can't see it, as we can see it, and the fact that we're looking at this Andromeda Galaxy, it's proof that the universe is at least 2.5 million years old, and that puts it way out of the timeline of young Earth creationism. But that's only what we can see with the naked eye. Scientists have now been able to discover even more distant objects with the advanced technology like the Hubble Space Telescope. And Hubble has detected a galaxy 13.4 billion light years away, meaning that the universe must be at least that million years old, 13.5 billion years old. Now, according to Genesis, God created the stars on the fourth day of creation, which young Earth creationists say was between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. However, there is observable evidence that the universe is over 13 billion years old. They don't match up. And then let's move then to where a lot of people want to focus on geology. Here's the reality. The Earth's crust consists of distinct layers of rock, and the fossilized remains of animals from the distant past are preserved within those layers. If you travel through the American Southwest, these layers are clearly visible in the mountains, mesas, and canyons you see. You'll see different color strata with these different geological layers. Now, creationists love to point out that science concedes that these layers were laid down very rapidly. They weren't built up over long periods of time. They were laid down rapidly. And creationists love this because then they claim that it didn't take millions of years for this to happen. These layers were all formed by Noah's flood. And, so it is true that the geological layers are, laid down very rapidly by things like floods, mudslides, volcanic activity, and other disasters. And the reality is we wouldn't have fossils without these type of disasters that create these layers, because if an animal isn't buried shortly after its death, it will decay, bones and all. That is, if the bones aren't scattered around and gnawed away by woodland animal, scavengers. So rapid burial is necessary for the fossilization to occur. So when young Earth creationists are where the young Earth creationist argument falls, however, is that a single cataclysmic event like a global flood wouldn't give us what we see in the geological record. A global flood would certainly leave a layer of sediment, but you would have a single layer with fossilized remains of all the animals who were alive at that time in that layer. So if the young Earth creationist view is correct, the geological record would give us a single, let's say exceptionally thick layer with all the species of animals that exist, being fossilized in that one single layer. What we have, though, is not one layer, but several layers stacked on top of each other with very distinct differences in the fossils that we find within each layer. This points to numerous distinct calamities that had enough time between each of them for the sediment layer to harden into stone, and each layer capturing different species that would have existed at the time that layer was weighed down. So since the fossil evidence of that layer contains different species, it testified that there was enough time between each layer for the the animal species that existed in that area to have all died out, and a whole new, group of species to have taken its place. Therefore, these layers provide a historical record of a sort that goes back millions of years, not a few thousand years. Now, I mentioned the layers are visible when you travel through the American Southwest because, and the reason those are visible is erosion has exposed them. That's another geological thing I want to point to, because it would take an extremely long period of time for that much erosion to occur. Let's take the Grand Canyon, for example. This canyon averages 4,000 feet deep, and at its deepest point is actually 6,000 feet deep. It cuts through multiple layers of rock, and those rocks are caused by both sedimentary and volcanic deposits. The canyon was carved by the erosion of the Colorado River, and scientists estimate that it would have taken over 5 million years for that river to cause that much erosion. That's the lower end of the estimates. Some put it, 3 times that much time. But let's just say it's 5 million years. Young Earth creationists argue that an event like Noah's flood would have dug it much faster. They point to a canyon formed in Washington state by the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. This eruption triggered the largest landslide in recorded history, which carved a 65-foot deep canyon in just a few hours. And they conclude that this proves that the Grand Canyon could have been carved out in a very short period of time by Noah's flood. This type of thing does excite people desperate for any information that will challenge the scientific consensus about the age of the Earth. The problem is that comparing this canyon with the Grand Canyon is like comparing apples to oranges. The ground around Mount St. Helens consists of non-compact gravel, ash, and mud, while the Grand Canyon is solid rock. Now, anyone who thinks about this for even a minute will realize that you can dig through loose soil much faster than solid rock. Now, imagine if you and I were to take shovels and have a contest to see who could dig the deepest hole in a given amount of time. But I'm going to be digging through loose soil, and you're going to dig through concrete. I'm confident that I'm going to win that contest, regardless of how strong you are. After an hour, I could have a pretty deep hole, while I'm doubting that you're going to even scratch the surface of that concrete after an hour with a shovel. So, to further distinguish this canyon from the Grand Canyon, the area around Mount St. Helens is really steep and mountainous, while there's very flat land around the Grand Canyon. This means that the flow of mud, water, or rivers, or whatever, is going to be much faster around the Mount St. Helens than it would be around the Grand Canyon. Faster flowing water is going to produce much greater erosion than slower flowing water. So this is like putting a person with a shovel against a bulldozer. It's not the same thing. And despite all the advantages of the St. Helens Canyon, it was only 65 feet deep. And without any major eruption to contribute to it in the years since, it hasn't gotten any noticeably deeper over the last 45 years since its formation. So it quickly dug out 65 feet and stopped. The Grand Canyon isn't 65 feet deep, it's 6,000 feet deep, almost 10 times as deep. So the St. Helens Canyon is hardly worthy of the title Little Grand Canyon that young Earth creationists like to give it. I point this out as an example of the deceptive arguments that young Earth creationists employ to undermine the overwhelming evidence that the Earth is much older than their beliefs demand that it be. I call it out as deceptive because to show you how they can do this in a deceptive way, when I was actually researching this video, I came across another video produced by Awesome Science Media about this very canyon. In the video, they never refer to the Bible, and the name of their channel, Awesome Science Media, suggests that they're a strictly scientific education channel. And there's a claim made in this video that in light of this canyon here near St. Helens, and I quote, most scientists now believe that the Grand Canyon was created very rapidly. This claim is a lie. Most scientists don't believe this. This is a claim that you're not going to find outside of the propaganda created by young Earth creationists. And here you have a young Earth creationist platform presenting themselves as just a scientific platform, and they are, trying to present their propaganda as the consensus of most scientists. It's just not true. So here I've pointed to archaeological, astronomical, and geological evidence that demonstrate that the Earth is much older than young Earth creationists insist that it has to be. Now, I want to point out one thing, that how I dealt with this for once I realized that I couldn't out-science the scientists, is science does rely on inductive reasoning that determines the most probable explanation of facts. This means that there is always going to be another possible explanation of the facts, and scientists often amend their understanding in light of new discoveries. That happens all the time. This is what we thought happened, but we discovered new evidence. Now we're going to have to make some adjustments to what we thought. But this does create a lack of certainty within scientific explanations. And for a long time, I tried to take solace in this and say that maybe they are misinterpreting the data, that there is another interpretation of the data that allows for young Earth creationism. But I evidently had to accept that while there is some uncertainty intrinsic to all scientific discovery, the discovery of new evidence can eliminate some explanations. And the reality and the fact is that there is enough evidence to eliminate the possibility of the Earth and the universe only being a few thousand years old. They may make some adjustments at times saying, okay, you know what, the Earth is, not as old as we thought. We're talking about, might be, we've discovered it's 15 million years old instead of 20 million years old, or something of that level. But we know it can't be just a few thousand years old, based on the facts and the science. Now, I want to reiterate that I'm sharing this to you as a devout believer in Jesus Christ. A believer in Jesus Christ who takes the Bible very seriously. In my last video I produced, I defended the notion of miracles. I have no doubts that God has the ability to create a universe in a few days if He chose to. The evidence is overwhelming, however, that this is not what God did. So how should we respond to this as Christians? Now, imagine a person, and we'll call him Charlie, and he went for a physical, and the doctor saw some things that troubled him, had him do an x-ray, and he discovered a malignant tumor. The doctor says that he believes Charlie's chances of recovery are very high with the proper medical treatment. Charlie, however, is a Christian, and he chooses to go to a televangelist faith healer instead of getting medical treatment. The televangelist puts his hand on Charlie's head and declares that he is healed. And Charlie walks away completely confident that he is cancer-free. And he doesn't need the doctor to tell him so, because he has faith. He skips his follow-up appointment with the doctor because he doesn't need it. He's been healed. Charlie's wife, though, eventually convinces him to go back to the doctor, but it takes her several months for him to do so. The doctor gives Charlie another x-ray and discovers that not only has the tumor still there, it's actually grown significantly. Charlie's chances of success, full treatment, aren't nearly as good as they were, according to the doctor. But if he immediately begins a much more aggressive treatment, he still has a fair chance of recovery. Charlie, however, laughs off the doctor's advice, saying, I don't care what that x-ray shows. I have faith that God healed me. Now, at this point, is Charlie being faithful or foolish? I hope you agree with me that at this point, Charlie is actually being foolish. While God is capable of healing Charlie, he's evidently chosen not to. Charlie should recognize that the advancements in medicine are actually gifts from God themselves and trust God to work through those medical means rather than miraculously healing him. So what does Charlie's story have to do with the age of the earth? Like Charlie, many Christians insist on believing something by faith, even though there's overwhelming evidence that their belief isn't true. We're really left with three options. One, we can't ignore the facts and cling to what we want to believe is true. This is where many evangelicals find themselves, and I admit that I was one of those evangelicals for many years. A second option is we can conclude that the Bible has been demonstrated to be false and reject it along with the Christian faith, and this is where many scientifically minded people are. But there's a third option. We can re-examine the book of Genesis and ask whether or not we've misinterpreted it. And this is where I stand today, along with many others. Once I broke free from my indoctrination, I employed basic principles of biblical interpretation to Genesis, as well as the literary skills I developed in my profession as a high school English teacher. And now I recognize the so-called literal reading of Genesis isn't the only valid interpretation, and it isn't even the best interpretation. And I've really come to, as I continue to study, I've concluded that it really is a bad interpretation of the Bible. And in my upcoming videos, I'm going to finish out the series on reconciling the Christian faith with science by looking at what the first chapters of Genesis actually say and demonstrating why this passage was never meant to be interpreted literally. Now, if you've rejected the Christian faith in the past because you realize the notion of a 6,000-year-old earth is not feasible, I hope you're going to join me for these upcoming videos. Likewise, if you've been indoctrinated into believing that taking the Bible seriously demands that you interpret Genesis in this way, if you're willing to consider the possibility that what you've always been led to believe is incorrect, I hope you tune in as well. And as I referenced multiple times in this video, I was indoctrinated into this reading of the Bible as well. And I'm also, and I'm embarrassed to say now, I was guilty of furthering the indoctrination in others. But I broke free from that indoctrination. And when I did so, it allowed me to have a deeper and richer understanding of the Bible. And I'm also free from having to ignore and explain away good science. And it was very liberating for me. I don't have to sit there and deep down saying, I'm having to believe something that is against the facts. I can sit there and hold to the facts while also believing the Bible, because I'm actually reading the Bible the way it was meant to be interpreted. Now, I'm not the final word on this topic, but I am committed to honestly evaluating the facts to the best of my ability and following the facts where they lead. I'm dedicated to presenting my honest evaluation based on years of study and reflection. I can assure you that what you hear from me will always be a sincere presentation of my conclusions, and they aren't beholden to any agenda other than discovering the truth. I'm not here as a representative of any specific religious organization or a Christian organization that's given me a list of beliefs of what I have to believe. That's just not where I'm at. Unfortunately, there are Christians out there who will twist facts and even completely make things up to further their theological agenda. And they're either too entrenched in their narrow point of view to see the facts, or they're deliberately being deceptive so that you will believe what they want you to believe. Now, only God can judge the hearts of these Christians. but I'm not that kind of Christian.